Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this, the last lecture of the academic year 2024 to 2025, and a particular welcome to our online audience joining us on Zoom. If I could ask you please to mute and turn off your cameras, this will improve the bandwidth for the lecture. And before introducing our speaker, could I invite the Secretary to read the minutes of the last meeting?
The sixth meeting of the 132nd season took place at the Society of Antiquaries, Burlington House, Piccadilly, London, and online via Zoom on Tuesday, the 15th of April. Dr. Nicholas Bell, President, was in the chair. After the minutes of the previous meeting had been read and signed, Dr. Bell introduced Dr. David Shaw, who delivered the 2025 Graham Pollard Memorial Lecture entitled The Stationers and the Poor Law. When the meeting was open to discussion, the following took part: Ms. Margaret Willis, Professor Miriam Foote, Dr. Kelly McKay, Judith and Arthur Marks, Professor Michael Winship, and Mr. Giles Mandelbrot. Dr. Bell thanked Dr. Shaw warmly for his paper.
Are you happy for me to sign these minutes? Thank you. Thank you. By tradition, the final lecture of the year is on a subject relating to bookbinding. In 1990, Dr. Phiroze Randeria provided a generous endowment to the Bibliographical Society to honour the memory of his elder brother, Homee Randeria. Dr. Randeria held a deep interest in the history of bookbinding and attended the lectures assiduously from the first in 1991 until his death 10 years later, since when the lecture has been given in the name of both brothers. Our lecturer this evening delivered the third Homee Randeria lecture in 1993 and has been a much valued supporter of the Bibliographical Society in several ways in subsequent years, and previously, in fact. Nicholas Pickwoad is Professor Emeritus at the University of the Arts, London, and until his retirement in 2019, he was Director of the Legatus Research Centre, which is dedicated to the history of bookbinding. He has a doctorate from Oxford University in English literature. He trained in bookbinding and book conservation with Roger Powell and ran his own workshop from 1977 to 1989. He was advisor on book conservation to the National Trust from 1978 and was editor of the journal Paper Conservator from 1984 to 89. He taught book conservation at Columbia University Library School in New York from 1989 to 92 and was chief conservator in the Harvard University Library from 92 until 1995. And he gave the 2008 Panizzi Lectures at the British Library and was awarded the Plowden Medal for Conservation in 2009. Nicholas's lecture this evening is entitled and concerns one of several aspects of binding practice which we consider today to be ubiquitous, but which only came into widespread use a very long time after the beginnings of the Codex. So, without further ado, could I please ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Pickwoad to deliver the Randeria Lecture for 2025.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm juggling with several pieces of technology, and they seem to work. It's a great pleasure to be here, a great pleasure to be doing this the second time round. When I was asked the first time, I thought it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. It turns out this is a repeat occasion, which is very enjoyable. And I've chosen the title, Entitled, because it's a subject about which I know far too little, and I thought it was about time I knew more. And so what you're going to hear this evening is some early thoughts on the subject, shall we say, some observations and some conclusions, I hope, and some things, one or two things, I hope, which may surprise you. We live in a world today where new books are rarely found without a title, presented in a bewildering variety of styles. And the idea of a bound book without a title would seem odd, if not perverse. And books in plain covers, after all, have a rather dubious reputation. It may therefore come as something of a surprise to learn that until well into the 18th century, books, if sold bound, would seldom have had formal titles, though they might have had some simple form of identification, such as here a volume number or a short manuscript title to assist a bookseller in retrieving them from a stockroom. It was then left to the owner to decide on the title, and a note might be written on the end leaves or even the title page of the book, especially if it was bought in sheets and there were no end leaves to write on, giving instructions to the binder as to what was required, as here in a book owned by the 5th Earl of Exeter, specifying even the truncation of the word bibliotheca to biblioth to allow larger letters to be used. A common practice in the late 17th century when this note was written, and when candlelight and rather basic spectacles, I suspect, were the norm, so large letters would be a good idea. Because adding titles to bindings was, at an early date at least, mostly not part of the trade of bookselling but left to the customer, the field is so vast and varied that in 45 minutes I cannot do justice to all the possible variations. For this lecture, I have therefore picked out some of the distinctive and sometimes unexpected practices that I have encountered in library stacks and in the literature of bookbindings and gleaned from book sale and book dealer catalogues. I am, however, very much aware that many in this audience especially will have seen other and different phenomena, and I hope that by putting my material before you, it might be possible to encourage a greater dialogue on the topic, because it's one we need to know more about, I think. Conferring a title on a book can give it a certain status, as is well exemplified by the typical Dutch retail bindings of the 18th century with quarter covers, which when first bound usually have uncut edges, pink-stained alum-tawed skin on the spine, and marble paper on the sides, and without any tooling on the spine. It seems clear that some owners, or possibly booksellers in more upmarket shops, added tooled titles in gold to these bindings. A little hard to see on this one, but in the second panel, you can just make out the title, but without any other tooling on the spine. Giving a small degree of permanence, if you like, to a binding that would not have been thought to have been in a finished state. These bindings were well forwarded, presumably with the intention that the inexpensive quarter covers could be removed and replaced with a more permanent cover of some sort, full leather perhaps. The addition of the gold-tooled title indicates a decision not to proceed with that recovering of the binding, and therefore gives the status quo a certain degree of permanence. Some owners seem to have gone a stage further and added small decorative tools in the spine panels and a gold-tooled title on a leather lettering piece in the second panel on the spine. The addition of the pink-stained alum-tawed skin on the outer corners of the boards on this binding might suggest that the binding was always intended to be better finished, but many of these bindings which do not have any tooling still have these corners, and the uncut edges at this date would still indicate a temporary status for the binding. My research in recent years shows that the book trade made use of unfinished bindings, probably with the intention of holding the gatherings together as the books went through the trade, and to leave the choice and the expense of the covering material to the eventual owner. Even in their unfinished state, some sort of title would have been useful, particularly to booksellers with large stocks of books. And I think that the man in the green jacket in this fresco in the Salone Sistina in the Vatican Library, who by virtue of the fact that he is much better dressed than the other two binders, who are scarcely dressed at all, is probably to be seen as a bookseller, or at least the man running the operation, and is clearly writing something on the end leaves of a sewn book block, as the sewing supports and their unlaced slips show this book has neither boards nor cover. This, I believe, is most likely to be a book title, though possibly it could be the name of the client for whom the book was sewn. Surviving examples of such titles are by their nature rarely found today, but this sewn book block you see here on the screen is, sorry, I'm lost on my iPad. Yep. It has two titles on it, basically. It has end leaves of thick parchment, a document dated 1506, so the binding is quite considerably later than the date of printing. And the title you see at the top of the screen on the right, in large capital letters, is, I suspect, probably written by the first owner to identify it in wherever they kept the book. The other title is upside down at the bottom of the leaf and is repeated on the other side of the screen, the right way up, explaining that it is the letters of Petrarch, Epistolae Familiares, written upside down, I suspect because when it was written, the book was the wrong way up, but actually that was the side that many Italians would have written a title on at that time. On the back, the right side of the cover, it would have been an instinctive place to put it to an Italian. So they may not have noticed even that the book was upside down. I don't think it refers to some arcane storage process in their stockroom. Here we have on the left-hand side a very brief inscription on the recto of the left end leaf of this copy of Paulus Venetus's commentary on Aristotle, followed by the word carte, paper, and the number 76. And I suspect this could only have been of use to a bookseller, though the abbreviated title on the copy of an essay in defense of the female sex of 1679 on the right side, also written on the recto of the first leaf, free end leaf, may have been written as a guide to a binder for the title on the spine, phenomenon to which we've just seen and we will return. Either way, these are titles written in unfinished bindings and would have been hidden if and when the leaves were used as paste downs. So you will find these occasionally in books where the paste down is lifted. You'll find a title in a place where you could never see it, and it must have been written for an earlier purpose. The minimal laced-on cover, quarter cover of this Dutch edition of 1613 was presumably intended to give a cheap, short-term protection to the sewn book block with its uncut edges, but also provided a place for a neatly written manuscript title. So neatly written, in fact, that I wonder whether it was written before the parchment was laced onto the book block, and whether, therefore, the main purpose of the quarter cover was, in fact, to provide a substrate for the title. It's not certainly protecting much in the way of the book block. This was not a consideration, clearly, for those responsible for adding the titles to these two sewn book blocks, which have no covers at all, and which were shelved vertically with their uncovered spines exposed and their shelf marks added separately from their titles. The one on the right was not only printed in Helmstedt, but is in the Helmstedt University Library, now at Wolfenbüttel. Though whether the slip of paper and the title, with the title in manuscript, was pasted to the spine by the printer bookseller Müller or by the university librarian is unclear. The rather accurate and professional way in which it is pasted to the sides of the binding, as well as the spine, to reduce the risk of its peeling away from the spine, it's a very common phenomenon with these paper labels, does rather suggest that it is a professional piece of work, rather clumsily overwritten with a darker ink right at the top of the spine. And it has no cover, as you can see. The end leaves are made of a thick cartonnage, which offers a measure of protection while the book goes through the book trade. As books were expensive, it is not surprising to find that booksellers would want to give them adequate protection as they made their way through the trade, as in this 1483 edition of Avicenna, which has thin boards of blue cartonnage sewn to the slips of the four split-strap Allen-Todd sewing supports, typical of its date. It has two manuscript titles on the left side, one in highly abbreviated Roman caps, and below it, a title in Gothic lettering on a paper label. Neither of which would have survived the discarding of these boards in favor of the wooden boards. This large folio volume would undoubtedly have been given had it been completed. The book was also given much later an alum-tored sheepskin spine, probably in 1768, the date of the new library of the Benedictine monastery of St. Peter in Salzburg, who then owned the book, with new title labels, which recorded also another work, identified as Jacobi Folivicensis, which has since been removed. It would appear that selling books bound in boards without covers was done, as we've just seen, from a very early date. And these two mid-17th century examples, made in the same French workshop, have remained uncovered, with their titles written across the head of each left board, each in a different hand. And this example, printed in 2 volumes in Cologne, but bound in Lyon, is much the same, except that it has what appears to be a Lyon economy, in sewing on 4 supports spaced as if for 5, with the central one omitted from the sewing, to be supplied by a false band as and when the book was covered. It has a highly abbreviated title, just the author's name and one name from the title, and also written just below it, the name Devers, linking it to the Lyon booksellers of the same name, showing that the title was written on the left board for use within the Lyon book trade. So these are titles made for the book trade, not for the private owner, and I think that is quite significant. Evidence for the sale of books without covers can be hard to find when the bindings have subsequently been completed. But the title written as here on the spine of the book block under the parchment cover of the book, now revealed by the depredations of a hungry rodent, gives definitive evidence of the acquisition of this book as a sewn book block by a convent close to Syracuse in Sicily, which was given the sort of title in large Gotico rotondo lettering that one might expect to find on the spine of a parchment cover, but here written as a longitudinal title on the spine linings, with a later lateral title label above it, only for both of them to be covered when the book was eventually given a cover with its own new title. Something similar is happening to the left, on the left extension of the parchment comb lining of this contemporary French binding on a Rome edition of 1651, which has the title of the book, possibly also acting as an instruction to the binder, together with a very general description of the required tooling on the spine, dos plein, full spine. The spine is to be filled with gold tooling, an instruction which was clearly followed, as you can see from the photograph. Sadly, the rest of the instruction was cut off when the extension was trimmed back before it was adhered to the inside of the board, because that would have been the more interesting part for me, but it's gone. The book was given this title quite probably as an uncovered binding in boards before the cover was put on. As we have seen, there is a considerable leeway in where titles might be written, even before bindings were completed. But the process of selecting where to write titles does not stop once the bindings were completed, as titles changed according to where the books were shelved, sometimes recording a complex journey through the shelving. This legal text by Tiracco, printed in Venice in 1560, was first shelved with its left side exposed, in a manner often seen in early 16th century representations of authors in their studies, but which cannot accommodate very many books. As collections grew, books had to be rearranged. Here, presenting the foredge to view, with a new, shorter title, but written by the same hand. The uppercase Q in both has the same shape of tail to it. Though after a while, the spine was turned outwards, with the title in a neat italic hand. When more books had to be fitted in the shelving, the books were turned with a narrower tail edge outwards, with the title in a different hand, thus allowing more books to be fitted in the shelves, and this became a very common Italian form of titling, until at last, the books had to be turned upright to save even more space and were titled accordingly. So you have one book with 5 titles going through a succession of shelves, if not a succession of libraries. The Italian use of tail edge titles can be seen in this portrait of the lawyer Francesco Righetti by Guercino, painted in 1626-28, and on the right by a pile of Italian bindings of the 16th and early 17th centuries, with titles written in different hands, different styles, and with very different levels of competence, which raises the question of who was responsible for writing these titles, some of which, such as the one at the bottom of the pile, show a level of professional skill that suggests they might have been done in the trade or by a professional calligrapher, while the one above it has a decidedly amateur feel to it. The owner's grandchild, perhaps, who knows. It's scrawled rather than inscribed, shall we say. And that's one of the big questions about these manuscript titles, is who wrote them? Who is the audience for these titles? And that, of course, is very hard to find out. Longitudinal foredge titles of this sort are typical of late 15th and early 16th century bindings. In this case, an English binding, and the title running from head to tail to match the right side upwards storage of the books. You can see the catch plates on the upper board in the photograph. Though it was not long before the book was shelved vertically, foredge outwards, with a new title to match, you can see at the left-hand end and below it. Other frequently encountered types of titling include titles written across the head edge, as sometimes it would appear out of necessity. The Gwilym is probably too tall for its shelf and was put on its foredge and titled accordingly. And the one below it, Ange, is simply the abbreviated name of Angelo Gambiglioni, the author of the book. That's all the owner of this book required to identify it on his shelf. In the middle, you can find a book which is titled On the Foredge Cover Extensions. If they're wide enough, you can put a title on them, and therefore write on parchment rather than the edge of the text block, and that was clearly what was done here. But on the left is the more typical variety that you'll find, the title written on the foredge of the cut foredge of the book block, the author's name, Ferri, in Matteum. And these abbreviations are very interesting too, because they select words from the title for reasons known only to them. Sometimes they are not even the author's name or any of the important words we would associate with the title, but they are what were distinctive and important to the owner of the book. The extensively decorated foredges you see here are exceptional, but you will find them in plenty of libraries. And they can be for either orientation. They can be for vertical storage or horizontal storage. It's a big question I'll come back to as to whether these longitudinal titles actually imply horizontal storage or not, because we have evidence to suggest that they weren't. And in some cases, as in the Alfonso de Castro in the bottom, the title is very decorative, but it is very hard to understand. It actually reads the first two letters Castro, or the first two symbols, so a CA and then S and T, and then you've got DE for day, and then Jus for Justa, and Hereticorum is HE, heavily abbreviated, and then right at the end, PV for Punitione. You have to know the title before you can even read it, which does make you wonder exactly what its purpose is. As the most extreme example, should we say, of forage titling, it comes from the Piloni Library, painted by Cesare Vecellio at the very end of the 16th century. It is unique, I think, in its extent, though there are very heavily decorated edges found elsewhere as well. But the title is not only in the words, but also in the pictures with fictive portraits of the authors and so on. As indicated by the first title on the copy of the Tiraco we've just seen, the use of titles on the sides of bindings is the one most often encountered on the contemporary bindings of the earliest printed books. And these titles, as shown in this slide, can be found on the left or right sides of the bindings, following a fairly reliable rule, which is that bindings from the Germanic countries typically have their catch plates attached to the left board, which means the books were opened from that side and were shelved and titled accordingly, whereas books from most of the other European countries were shelved and opened from the other side and have titles on the right side of the binding. In Italian bindings, however, the two on the right are Italian bindings, but in some Italian bindings, you'll find the direction of fastening is the other way around, and fastening in the Germanic pattern. And I suspect this is more often found in the north of the country. I have a colleague working in Venice who declares soundly that in Italy, they always do it in the German way, because she works in Venice, and in Venice, a lot of the books follow the Germanic pattern. If you go further south, you'll find many, many more books following the same pattern that the English and the French and the Spanish use. The Spanish are very dedicated catch plates on the right board, the back board, which I've discovered recently. No exceptions to it at all. It can lead to anomalies, of course, where you have a binding like this, a Germanic binding, a German binding in alum towards skin, with the strap attached to the back board, the right board, catch plate on the other board, but it has an Italian title on the right board, which is the wrong way up, because in order to open the book, you have to turn it over, which means you look at the title, then you turn the book over to open it, rather than looking at the title and then opening the book, which is the way it ought to work. And it's extraordinary how the titling habits may actually be stronger than the practical matter of how to open the book most easily when you get it off the shelf. On Italian bindings in limp bindings with covers of both parchment and cartonnage, both orientations can be found, as you can see on the screen here. And I have as yet not been able to find any pattern in the different usages. The problem being, of course, in working out where such bindings were bound. I know that they're Italian. I can guess that some of them may be North Italian rather than South, but that's about as far as it goes. Which city they may come from is another matter. In the 16th century, Italian practice tends to incline to the left side for titling, and there are many examples that you'll see of this of all levels of quality. The titles written across the head of the book on the left-hand side, a book covered in manuscript waste with a part of the head margin exposed at the top of the cover, and that's where they've written a very faint title to indicate very briefly what is inside the book. The cartonnage binding on the right with rather neater Gothic script, black letter script, neatly written. I suspect these are bookseller titles rather than personal titles, but again, we live in a land of unknowing when it comes to this sort of thing. Some owners also went to trouble to have very fine pieces of calligraphy on the covers of their books. The lettering on both of these, although sadly damaged, you can see the quality of the lettering on both. These are not cheap amateur work. It is very professional and very elegant work. On the reverse skins used by Italian binders, which would have been a pure creamy white when they were new, but sadly it doesn't last very well. And some owners went to considerable trouble to decorate the titles on their books. Clearly more time on their hands than we might think reasonable in a library, but very elegant and very beautifully done in many cases. And these are not uncommon in Italian bookbinding in the 16th century. For books with stiff boards, the most elaborate titles come protected by copper alloy frames and pieces of transparent horn to protect the title underneath, written on paper or parchment. And this is very much a medieval technique that survives into the printed book world, even as late as you can see on the right as the 1520s on this edition of Jerome's letters. But a huge variety of different methods was also used, including in the center, titles impressed with large Gothic letters painted in a shell gold alloy, which fit into a blank compartment at the head of the tool design on the left board, a style of titling particularly associated with bindings for Anton Koberger in Nuremberg. The binding on the left has a parchment label which was secured to the board under the corner pieces, and the nail in the left-hand one goes through the corner of the label, showing that the label was not added as an afterthought, as so many of them appear to have been, such as the long label adhered to the left side of the Italian binding on the right-hand side. That is simply a piece of paper pasted across the binding. It's a dark leather binding, the ink would not show on it, so they pasted a piece of leather in order to make the title show. And that's where the trouble lies, is where there are so many variations in the way these things were done that trying to define patterns becomes very complicated very quickly. Elegant gold tool bindings in the 16th century often have titles included within compartments formed out of the decorative designs on their left sides, the front boards. Though what I believe to be a Spanish binding on the right has its very conspicuous gold tool title on the right side, reflecting its clasping direction, and somewhat unusually giving the titles of both the editions bound together in the volume. So you've got two titles in very large letters. It's very, to me at least, very unusual piece of work, but I think very Spanish. It's certainly in a library in Seville and has been there for a very long time. Some binders would leave compartments within tool designs ready for the inclusion of a title, even as here on an Italian quarter binding, it is confusing you. The title is on the left side of the binding, while the clasp straps show that the book was intended to be opened from the other side. So the person tooling the book intended it to be opened from this side, and then the straps were attached, which have to be opened from the other side. And I find this anomaly very confusing. I suspect they may have done so at the time as well. It was, of course, up to the owner as to whether that blank panel compartment would have been filled in with the title, and there are plenty of examples where it isn't. The one on the left here has a rectangular panel, I think you can just see here, which would take a title, but it's never been put in. Here you have the same thing, and what I call the initial panel here, the initial field above the block in the center, and the date field at the bottom. The date field has a date in it, which is the date of printing, possibly also the date of binding, though it's never entirely clear what that date necessarily refers to. Blank spaces have an unexpectedly long life in the history of early modern bookbinding, appearing right at the end of the 18th century on some Germanic adhesive case bindings, leaving to the customer the choice of the title. The example on the right preserves its folded book jacket, also with a label, but in this case with a manuscript title, presumably for the convenience of a bookseller to identify it in their stock. The customer presumably would be expected to discard the jacket and use the blank title for their own title, but it's been left blank for them to do that. And the one on the left doesn't have a jacket anymore, though it's so well preserved it probably did have, and an absolutely blank title. From the point when the owners of books began to shelve their books with their spines outwards, which happens through the 16th and 17th centuries, depending on what part of Europe you're in, the spine becomes the locus of choice for titling for obvious reasons, whether along longitudinal titles or across the spine lateral titles. The Spanish book trade retained longitudinal titles well into the 18th century, even though, as contemporary paintings indicate, the books were not always stored horizontally. And it raises a question which is always in my mind as to how accurate are paintings? Do they reflect what was actually done? And there are a lot of these Spanish paintings showing usually religious writers with books behind them, and the shelves are vertical, even though they are titled as if for horizontal storage. And this is happening in 1629 when this painting was completed. You can see other books in the shelves with horizontal titles in their foredges, but on the spines, the longitudinal titles are vertical. So they seem to write in both directions, from spine to head, from tail to head, from head to tail. And you have that terrible bookshop problem of your neck going backwards and forwards as you try to read the titles on the spines of the books. Again, there is no coherent evidence as to who was using which, not at least that I know of. The lateral titles begin to appear just before the second half of the 18th century and become sometimes very nicely decorated. The flowers at the bottom, these can be recognized according to the monasteries they come from. They had somebody in the team who was able to paint these very beautiful flowers, and going around the university stacks in Seville a couple of months ago, you could find, you knew which libraries they came from according to the flowers painted on their spines, which is a nice way of identifying them. But they are clearly horizontal titles. And the other thing you can see very clearly with the horizontal titles is that they're using lowercase lettering to fit longer words across the spine. It's one of the problems of lateral titles. You have to have short words. This helps you get longer words onto the spine. The double lines above and below, which you can see in the one second from the right, it had a longitudinal title when it was first bound in 1714, presumably, or shortly after. It was then turned upwards, upright, and given a new title with the double line above and below, a pattern which goes right through into the 19th century. The one on the right shows an absolutely typical example of that double ruling above and below the lettering from 1797. I mean, the fact that a book is being bound like this in 1797, if you're a Northern European, is surprising enough in itself. This is a 16th century binding still being made at the end of the 18th century. But we'll come back to other surprising things towards the end of the lecture. Longitudinal titles work well on the spines of lace case bindings with smooth spines. You have a nice long expanse of parchment in which to write your title. But where the structure of the book in the form of raised bands, secondary tackets, spine straps, or long stitch sets interrupted the spine, as in these 16th century continental examples, the spine was adapted and the spine title was adapted and placed to fit the spaces available. Or in the case of the binding with the transverse twisted tackets, the cover was ruled from the inside and the title written on it before the cover was attached to the book block. So this is something quite unusual, that the cover is actually titled not on the book, but off the book, and then is put onto the book. And also the laced on cover, which you see at the top, again, it's creased from the inside of the cover to create lines for the title, and then it may have been titled on the book or off the book, that we can't say, but it was prepared for writing off the book. The ability to write the title on a cover before it was attached to the book block, inherent in case bindings, is an essential prerequisite for the future production of cheap publishers' bindings, to which we shall return. Given the variety of binding types used across Europe, it's not surprising that local styles of titling developed, as is shown in these very characteristic titles from both the Netherlands and England. The elegantly written Roman caps, lowercase and italic letter forms with their sharp serifs seen on the left, are found again and again on 17th and 18th century Dutch parchment-covered bindings, which makes the one at the bottom rather interesting. It's on a copy of Bearcroft's historical account of Thomas Sutton and of his foundation at Charterhouse, not a book you would expect to go down necessarily very well in the Netherlands. Who knows? It is possible it could have gone to Holland and come back again, but it was bought in 1762 by Richard Fitzwilliam, who had just left Charterhouse and gone to Cambridge as a student when he bought this book, The History of His Old School. I suspect this book has never left England and was bound in this way within the Dutch book trade in London. There were plenty of members of the Dutch book trade working in London. And this type of title, you can see the little flourishes on the capital C and the S. These are very Dutch habits of work, if you like, not at all English, to my mind. The books on the right-hand side of the screen show a selection of English lace-cased limp bindings in parchment covers of the late 16th and early 17th century, titled in a typically English style in a variety of hands, written either for a bookseller or for a private owner. And I'm not sure how you can differentiate between the two, except when you see this, you can say immediately that it is English, because it is a very, very characteristic style of titling. The only way you get any firmer handle on this is to start comparing identical copies of the same edition in the same bindings and see if you've got the same hand writing on the spine. Good luck to that one. There is a considerable variation in the amount of information included in the titles on books, from the minimal amount seen here on the 2 volumes on the left, which have on their title pages extremely long titles, and they simply been reduced in one case to one word, elegios. It'll do, that's all you need for this owner to recognize what the book is, with a nice flourish underneath to show that's as much as I'm giving you. In the middle, you have a composite volume with a number of pamphlets in it, each one given its title on the spine. Another advantage that a nice fat parchment binding gives you, you have a lot of space on which to write titles. Next to it is a very nice example of the work of the Herzog August at Wolfenbüttel, writing enormously elaborate titles on the spine. These are not really titles, these are notes about the edition, about comparing it with other copies and so on, and copied into the catalogues. The famous catalogues at Wolfenbüttel share the same information. And he was so obsessed with these labels that he would paste them onto the gold tooling on the spine of elaborately decorated bindings, even onto the covers of books covered in velvet and silk brocade. He wasn't interested. The title is what was important. Who knows, he may have been right. On the right side, there is a book from the library of Fernando Colon, rebound in the 18th century with a list of the classical authors whose works are found in it, elegantly displayed in manuscript on the spine between double lines. And it's a case where the title has become, in a sense, a part of the decoration of the book. It is done so elegantly that it is a decorated book. There are 2 of these in the Colon collection. Why just 2? Nobody knows. Volumes containing multiple works are, for obvious reasons, often problematic for binders when the owner asks for each work to be identified on the spine. And in this set of Mrs. Inchbald's British Theatre, the binder has arranged the false paired single bands on the spine, wide in the middle, as this arrangement was known at the time, in order to accommodate the titles of each play, often dramatically abbreviated to allow them all to be fitted into the space provided. So the binder actually has rearranged the design of the spine of the binding in order to accommodate the titles, rather than accommodating the title to the spine. So it's a reverse of what you normally would expect to find. Using lowercase Roman letters to accommodate longer words in manuscript lateral titles, as we have seen, was well known in Spain. But the first instance of tooled lowercase letters that I know of on a spine label appears on the copies of the 2-volume Baskerville edition of Milton, published in 1759 and bound for Baskerville in Birmingham. These bindings tend to have the marble paper, which is unique to Baskerville, the paper with which he did not win the prize for the best marble paper in England. It's a very curious marble paper, a very acquired taste, I think we can call it. But he used the metal type to make these labels. And foundry type, if used carefully, can be brought to a high enough temperature to set the egg layer used to adhere the gold leaf to the leather without melting the metal. Though why the Baskerville types were not used for the volume numbers below is something I cannot explain. It would be very easy to have VOL and 2 uppercase I's provided so that the volume numbers would match the title, but they don't. You have the very refined Baskerville type in the title, and then the rather clumsy, by comparison, bookbinder's letters down below. The volumes of the Correspondence of Frederick II in the middle of the screen use lowercase type to accommodate the names of his correspondents in the 4th panel on the spine here, thus allowing the owner to find the required volumes on his shelves. He doesn't have to open them to find them. He can get the correspondence of D'Alembert or Condorcet or whoever it may be, simply by looking at the very small lowercase letters tooled onto the spine in gold. And also just one slide to represent it, as it were. The use of lowercase lettering was very common in Germany in the 18th century as well, particularly at the end of the century, beginning of the 19th. And you'll find many titles, both in Roman type and in Fraktur, using lowercase. The use of type required the use of a type holder, illustrated in Seidler's Buchbinder Philosophie of 1708. So it starts very early in the 18th century. At least the equipment is there and presumably was being used. Identifying it is not always easy because a beautifully tooled title done with handle letters, very exactly done, will look very much as if it's done in a type holder. If the letters are slightly rotated, you can see that it's not. And occasionally, when something goes wrong, it becomes very clear, as you can see here. Don't know how do you explain this one. The top line is crooked. The bottom line is more or less straight, but upside down. And only the third line is more or less accurately tooled. I suppose third time lucky is one way to put it. And you can only do this with a type holder. So we have evidence for this French binder in the middle of the 18th century using a type holder. But you can't rely on this level of incompetence to give you the answer every time. There's no general agreement where lateral spine titles should be placed on the spine. Now, there is a general sense on books with raised bands that the second panel on the spine with raised bands was the favored location, a location created by the horizontal tool bands seen on the 1616 edition, second from the left. The titles pushed right up to the head of the spine were very commonly used in the Germanic world, either tooled or in manuscript on books with smooth spines. Books with raised bands, they tend to use the second panel just as most of the other binders in Europe were doing. But those titles right up at the head are not proof of German use, but they are very typical of German use. The one in the middle to the right with the title in the center of the spine is very unusual to my mind. But here is one. It's, the binding is later than 1564, but it is probably a late 16th century binding with a title placed in a very distinctive place. And again, if you find something like this on another book, you begin to think, is there a connection between these two? It's, I think, sufficiently unusual, though I may be proved wrong on that. And on the right-hand side is a book that was kept on one of the higher shelves in the old university in Uppsala. So they put the title at the bottom of the spine where you could read it, which is perfectly sensible, but does look strange to our eyes, conditioned by what is the typical pattern. And we can deduce from these examples of the variety. There is a variety, and there was a choice of what you wanted, either to follow accepted norms or to choose whatever pleased or was thought more convenient. These 5 books now in the Library de l'Escorial, bound in Paris around 1540, the early 1540s, are amongst the earliest known examples of what would now be seen as the standard pattern of titling. Gold-tooled spine titles in the second panel from the head, where the titles are contemporary with the binding of the books and were intended to be there from the start. They were identified by Isabel de Coniu, and we can be sure that the titles were not added later because the small tools tooled in gold in the center of the panels on 4 of them are not found in the second panels where the titles are found. This means that those panels were specifically reserved for the titles. The earliest English example is well known, dating from 1604, and this binding for Charles Somerset by the Eton binder Vincent Williamson. Though his workshop continued occasionally to use spine titles precociously ahead of other contemporary English binders until at least 1638. That's the latest date I found on a Williamson workshop binding. There may be later ones still to be discovered. Some 17 years after Williamson's name disappears from the Eton College records. For much of the rest of the century, as owners of books and institutional libraries turned their books round on the shelves, have their spines outward, the short-term answer to identifying the books when their spines were blank, especially when covered in dark brown leather on which the manuscript titles were unlikely to be visible, was to use paper labels until gold-tooled titles could be added. And bookbinders were quick to turn this to their advantage and offered their customers the possibility of having the newly visible spines tooled, either in their workshops or sometimes in the owners' houses, creating the likelihood that a library might be full of books with title labels all tooled by one binder who hadn't actually bound any of the books in the library. So it's something to be beware of when you're looking at such collections. If the text block edges were not even enough or able to take the ink of a manuscript title because the paper was not sufficiently sized, and I've seen several examples where this was the case, the ink just bleeds into the paper, small parchment or paper labels could be adhered to the inside of one or other of the boards and extended across the foredge when the books were shelved vertically and existing titles were no longer useful. The top left, the Trovamali, you can see it has a title on the left board, but that would be invisible when the book was shelved vertically. So it needed a new title, but the foredge is a bit uneven. Easier to put it on a label, stretch it across the spine. All too often, these survive only as stubs of parchment or paper adhered to the board, the part with the title having been lost or removed over the years. And they can, of course, be added to a book at any time, though the one at the bottom of the screen would appear to have been put in place fairly soon after the book was bound, looking at the lettering, and very neatly made with an extension that allowed it to be wrapped around the foredge of the book block and held in place when the book was held shut with the clasps. So a very neatly organized piece of titling, but probably nothing to do with the binder. In England, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, longitudinal paper labels were frequently used, adhered not to the board of a book, unless it was very thin, but to the foredge of a leaf about a quarter of the way through the book block and the outer part hanging over the edge, usually but not always the foredge. The practice was common enough for the pastel artist François Vispre to have drawn such a slip on a book at the feet of John Farr, who was sitting comfortably on a sofa reading another book, and he used the slip to sign his name on. But it was obviously a familiar enough pattern that he could do this without being suspected of doing something rather strange and unusual. This is how many books in private collections particularly were given titles. On the right-hand side, you can see a label that has fallen out of a book, homemade very clearly, and a nice piece of work for a wet afternoon, put the labels on the books in the library. And finally, of this sort, printed labels on an almanac that was kept in what I call a top-loading slipcase. The slipcase was open at the top, and you slid the book in vertically, and it has a title folded across the edge so that you can see what the book is without having to take it out of the slipcase. Very useful commercially. In a bookshop, you know what it is that you're getting off the shelves, and an inconvenience very often to readers who will tear them out, and you're just left with a strip of paper on the inside of the board. Pasted on labels of parchment or paper had, of course, as we've seen, been used on the sides and spines of books from very early times. But the use of printed labels appears to be an 18th century phenomenon. The example on the left here of 1736 being the earliest I've yet encountered. It allowed the book to be identified clearly and attractively. The use of the printed border and the black letter type shows that a little trouble was taken to make it look attractive. And multiple copies would no doubt have been printed to a sheet and then cut up, and none too accurately in this case, as you can see. The same economy would have been used to print the simple small label on the Newbery edition of 1760, using lowercase letters to fit the title onto the spine, which is seen as an innovation of Newbery's, and such printed labels were also a common feature of the French livre en brochure of the end of the 18th and the early 19th centuries, as well as on Italian lace case and bindings with drawn-on covers with these printed labels placed right at the top of the spine. And these are very, very numerous in the book trade in the 1790s and into the early 19th century, and elegantly printed with small decorative borders around them, as you can see. Printed labels were, oh, sorry, one more to go here. Very typical, well, not a very typical example, but a nice example of a very typical phenomenon are the printed labels used on the paper-covered publishers' bindings in England at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. Here, using one of the more exotic orange papers, with a price printed on them, as is often the case, and a rather upmarket binding with the green paper on the sides as well. But these printed labels were a common feature and obviously useful. They gave details, the date of the book, the volume number, and all importantly, the price that you would expect to pay. And they last well into the 19th century. Something rather different here. Printed labels are cheap to make and required little forethought and planning in the production of the books. But something very different happened with the publication of Jonas Hanway's Account of the Marine Society, which has the same format of cover as the typical English publisher's binding, with a quarter spine in a pale paper, white or cream-colored paper, and colored paper on the sides. But the quarter spine on these bindings has a printed design divided into 6 panels with the title of the book in the second panel, second printed panel in inverted commas, and emblematic designs in the other panels. It is quite obviously designed and printed well in advance of the binding. It is printed to be exactly the size of the book block when it is sewn, so it will fit the book, and it is title and format specific. You can't use it anywhere else, only on copies of this text. It is a very early, if not the first, example of a title-specific cover used in commercial publishing, but seems not to have been taken up by other booksellers, possibly because it was too expensive. It is probable that Hanway had a hand in its design and use, I suspect. The idea was taken up again towards the end of the century for West's Guide to the Lakes, but was never made general use of, being most probably, as I said, seen to be too expensive for bindings which had been thought of as temporary by much of the trade and its customers. But I think you can see these as precursors of the inboard bindings in printed covers that became very much more common in the early 19th century. And it's very hard to know what is a precursor. Just because it happens earlier, it doesn't mean to say it is a precursor. It simply could have arrived and disappeared. But the idea was around in the trade, at least at the end of the 18th century. It's not that the idea of printed covers with titles had not been tried before, as these very early printed covers, but these very early printed covers survive in such small numbers, usually one, that it is hard, if not impossible, to know what role they played in the book trade. It is significant, however, that this example has a cover tacked to a book block with unsupported sewing and is a very inexpensive binding. And it's got this cover on it with the title printed on it. I think there is a connection between these two characteristics. They seem to have had no long-term impact, though examples without titles, just with decoration, have survived in slightly larger numbers. And there are examples all the way through the 16th century of these designs without titles on them, but I'm interested tonight on covers with titles on them, so I shall not concern those. In England, the new magazines in the 18th century were the first to make extensive use of printed covers, which displayed the title of the magazine along with a small woodcut as decoration. Cave's Gentleman's Magazine, first published in 1731, was the earliest, but was soon joined by rivals, though none lasted as long. The idea was simple, taking the cheap blue paper so often used as plain wrappers, occasionally as we've seen with a printed label, and printing the title and other promotional material on the sides. But it marks a step forward in the pre-production of finished covers in advance of binding, however simple as these simple stitched bindings may have been. In the last quarter of the 18th century, such drawn-on covers with printed titles became increasingly common. The well-known cover designed for the planned series of works of Italian literature by Courret de Villeneuve on top left was in effect a factotum woodblock with a space in its spine for different titles and, if necessary, a volume number in metal type. But the series failed to catch on and few examples survive. The use of typographic covers, as in the example of 1782 from Milan at top right, is more common, and the Jena edition of 1799, bottom right, shows an elegant restraint, which looks very modern and rather attractive to, I think, 21st century eyes. But I always bear in mind Douglas Cockerell's statement saying it was easy to make a small amount of decoration look elegant, but difficult to make a lot of decoration look elegant. Just a few lines and some simple type, and it looks elegant. But books such as these can lay claim, I think, to be prototype paperbacks, and the inclusion of the title is an essential element of their design. They are title and format specific and mark the beginning of a revolution in publishing, that of mass-produced books in finished bindings. The unused print wrapper for an almanac at bottom left shows the addition of a small title label to be used on the slipcases in which such books were commonly issued, and an example from an almanac de Gotha to the left of it showing the title on the slipcase as well. I want to finish this tour through the titling of books with what is, to me at least, a new discovery: the use of printed titles on the parchment covers of 18th century Spanish lace case bindings. I've been able to spend some weeks in the past 2 years in Spanish libraries, thanks to a Leverhulme grant, and have got into that all-important position, the stacks, and been able to walk up and down shelves full of books and see things which you would never otherwise be able to find except by accident. And I have great gratitude to the Leverhulme for making this possible, and became increasingly aware of this phenomenon of printed titles as I did so. The earliest edition known to me, sorry, I've gone on just a bit too far. One slide here first. 2 books with printed covers from Venice. They are legal texts recording legal processes of such an arcane nature I cannot begin to understand what they are, and they went on for several years. And then at the end, when it finally is concluded, a printed volume sums up the the court case. And they have their covers printed before they are sewn through with long stitch bindings. So this is not a question of adding a printed wrapper to a binding. The wrapper is the binding, and it is printed before the book is sewn, and the book is sewn through them. And I think that is a very interesting concept to juggle with in terms of the making of these books. Now, back to the Propinomio Evangelico. This is what I first saw on the top one, in the Columbina Library in Seville, and then we began, my ex-student who works in Seville and I started going through the university library, and then the Library of the Capuchins, and then we wrote to people we knew in other libraries, and other copies began to come in. So these 6 are the ones that I know. 1733, we have a title printed with a decorative border of type ornaments, and they are all completely identical. I mean, the distortion in the parchment makes it difficult to be exact about it, but there's no doubt in my mind that these are all printed from the same setting of type. It's done before the parchment is folded and formed around the book, because it has to be, and these are, in effect, publishers' bindings, because the binding is being made by the person responsible for printing the book. And when you find 6 copies of them, and there undoubtedly will be more to be found, that's, I think, what we're looking at. And they're printed also very obviously with longitudinal titles, because in 1733, that was still the manuscript pattern on these bindings. The lateral titles hadn't come into play. But they did fairly soon. And here, 1763, it's thought, 5 copies of the same text, 4 of them in one library, but 1 from the Escorial. You can see the volume on the right of the group of 4. It hasn't been folded the same way as the other 3. So you've got a longer border at the head, and the title is dropped down the spine a little bit. And that, I think, again, is proof that we have printed sheets of parchment, and they're being folded by binders, not necessarily very carefully or accurately. But this also has the name of Juan Rodriguez of Cordoba, who is the man very closely associated with the production of these bindings. From Valencia, 1767, 4 examples, one of them upside down. Well, actually, the text block is the right way up. The cover has been put on upside down. And that, again, I think is proof that we're looking at something being done in large numbers. And the binder is simply slapping them out in the workshop and didn't notice this one was upside down. And it's stayed that way ever since. But looking at the titles, the one on the left is a different setting of type from the other 3. The bottom line is in Roman caps, not in italics. And the middle line is in italics and not in caps. So it's a different setting of type. Why? That I can't tell. They're all the 2nd edition, not the 1st edition. I hoped it might break down neatly that the odd one out was in the 1st edition and the others will be the 2nd edition, but they're all of the 2nd edition. But again, 4 is not a large number, but there will be more of these around in the relevant libraries. And here, the most numerous number of copies surviving from one of Rodriguez's publications, the Catálogo de los Obispos de Córdoba, the bishops of Córdoba. And this you can find not only in libraries all over Spain, but actually in the book trade in Spain. It is unfortunately a rather expensive book because Rodriguez is well known as a printer and his work is collected by people interested in Spanish printing. But here we have a large number of copies, all printed at the same time on a printing press. And there will be more to be discovered. And a 4-volume set here, and you can see very clearly that volume 3, there is spacing between the letters of the top line of the capital, Feria. They spaced it out to fit the wider spine, and even more on the thickest volume at the end. So they're simply adjusting the type on the bed of the press as they go through printing the different copies for the different volumes. Sorry, to the right place. Yes. And here just a slide showing 6 other examples that we found on the stacks in the University Library in Seville. These are single survivals in most cases. There will be more, but they're all printed, all but one of them printed by Rodriguez again, but one of them printed in Cadiz by Emanuelis Espinosa, which is the earliest, 1764. using lowercase letters as well. It's a phenomenon which is really surprising because nobody that I know of in Northern Europe was doing anything like it at the time. But it was being done clearly quite widely in Spain. And a real surprise, following a very poor quality image that I took as a screenshot from a catalogue of the Philadelphia Rare Book Company in 2011, thinking that looks curious, and put it to one side and forgot about it. Then I came across it again 2 weeks ago when I was working on these for this lecture. I thought that looks printed, and wrote to Philadelphia Book Company, who knew exactly where it had gone. It had gone to Notre Dame University. I wrote to them and they sent me the photograph on the left-hand side of the three. And then another ex-student of mine who works in the National Library in Mexico City came up with photographs of two more. So we have a Spanish edition using the same technology, this printed cover. And Martha Romero confirms that these are Spanish bindings. They're not bound in Spain and sent to Mexico. The parchment is Mexican parchment, which she's all too familiar with, very thick, coarse parchment, very much unlike anything you'll find in Spain. And a close-up of the printing, you can see that is a printed text on the left-hand side as well. They represent, to me, a remarkable marriage of what was by then an extraordinarily old-fashioned binding, the lace case limp parchment binding, and the very latest innovation in publishing in the form of the use of printed covers. And I would imagine there are a lot more to be found. How this one comes to be in Mexico, I don't know. Is there a connection between Rodriguez and the printer of this book? That is something to be found out if it's possible. But it's happening in the same decade, the 1770s, when Rodriguez was printing most of his examples. The process of adding titles to bindings is, I hope, as I have shown in this small selection, enormously rich and varied field of study, which combines so many different aspects, from the practical arrangement of books on shelving, the different techniques and styles used in different countries at different periods, and to which I've not paid much attention in this lecture, as time did not allow it, the selection of the information to include in a title on the binding, which may reveal how booksellers and readers reacted to their books. And I think in this connection also the inclusion of the names of famous printers and dates of publication. Baskerville's name appears over and over again on his editions, but other printers, I mean, Aldous notably from the collecting world, but other printers, commercial printers, get their names on titles sometimes in the 17th century, and why and who is doing this is of interest to me. But I will leave you with a title discovered by David Pearson on a book in the library at Felbrigg Hall, which shows, I think, very clearly what the owner of this book thought was important about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicholas, for that really impressive tour d'horizon of this extraordinary phenomenon, and especially for your last slide.